On the morning of November 7th, 2024, a USDA APHIS field contractor named Travis Mouton completed his third consecutive thermal sweep over a 15,000-acre private tract in Terrebonne Parish and filed an incident report that his supervisor initially flagged as a calibration error. For 31 months prior, that specific grid had returned an average biomass density of between 18 and 26 feral hogs per square mile, consistent, documented, expected. The sensors that morning returned a value of 0. Not a low count, not a suppressed reading. 0. Mouton recalibrated the equipment twice. He flew the grid a second time at a lower altitude. The number did not change. What you are about to watch is not a story about a mystery. It is a story about a methodology, a calculated, technology-driven eradication campaign that has been unfolding across the wetlands of Louisiana and southeast Texas for the past 3 years, with almost no public documentation and no official announcement of success. The silence in those swamps is not natural. It is engineered. To understand the weight of what Mouton's sensors recorded, you have to first understand what Louisiana has been dealing with for the better part of 4 decades. The state is home to an estimated 700,000 feral hogs. These animals inflict between $100 and $150 million in verified agricultural damage every single year. Crawfish operations gutted overnight, rice levees systematically collapsed, sugarcane operations losing entire planted sections before a single stalk reaches harvest. The USDA's own damage assessment reports describe the situation using the word uncontrollable in 3 consecutive years of published findings. Wildlife managers across the Gulf South have operated under a single governing assumption for decades. Feral hog populations, as R-selected breeders capable of producing 2 litters annually, cannot be eradicated. They can be pressured, they can be managed at the margins. But the math of their reproduction, as any wildlife biologist will tell you, has always outrun the math of any removal strategy humans have been willing to deploy. That was the consensus. That was what the data supported. That was what every peer-reviewed population model projected forward through the next century. And then, beginning in late 2023, researchers monitoring specific control zones in the Atchafalaya Basin began noticing something the models had not predicted. In sectors where population pressure was expected to be at its most resistant, the density counts weren't dipping. They were flatlining, not declining at the rate of an effective hunting campaign. Flatlining the biological signature of a population that is not being outpaced or displaced, but deleted. Think about that. Because the explanation for what happened in those swamps did not come from the hunting community, and it did not come from a conservation organization, and it did not come from a single press release issued by the state of Louisiana or the federal agencies responsible for managing invasive species on public land. It came from procurement records, flight manifests, and contractor invoices, the administrative residue of a war that was won in secret. And what those documents reveal about the tools that were used, the scale at which they were deployed, and the biological precision that was achieved, forces a question far darker than where the hogs went. It forces the question of what it now means that we know how to make them disappear at all. The drone data that Travis Mouton filed on November 7th was not an isolated incident. It was the clearest data point in a pattern that had been building for nearly 14 months across multiple parishes, multiple land holdings, and multiple independent monitoring systems, and the pattern, once you see it, is impossible to explain through any conventional wildlife management framework. Between September 2023 and November 2024, USDA APHIS monitoring contractors logged zero-density readings across 11 separate grid sectors in the Terrebonne Street, Mary, and Assumption Parish wetland corridors. 11 sectors. Combined, those grids represent approximately 340,000 acres of prime feral hog habitat, the exact terrain these animals evolved, behaviorally and physiologically, to dominate. Wallowing sites that had been in continuous use for years were dry and beginning to revegetate. Rooting corridors that had been churned to bear mud through repeated passage were growing back. Camera trap systems in the Atchafalaya spillway that had been logging between 30 and 80 animal movements per night logged nothing, not fewer animals, nothing. The swamp was not quieter, it was silent. And here is the detail that should stop you because it stopped the researchers. Feral hogs do not vacate suitable habitat. They do not migrate in the traditional sense. They do not seasonally relocate to avoid pressure the way deer or waterfowl do. When a hog population abandons territory this productive, this completely, there is only one explanation the biology supports. They did not leave. But to understand why the hogs vanished, we first have to understand why we were told they could never be stopped. Now, here is what you need to understand about the war on feral hogs, because for decades, we were fighting it with entirely the wrong weapon. The conventional answer to the feral hog crisis was the American hunter, millions of them. Louisiana has no closed season on feral hogs, no bag limit, no licensing requirement for removal on private land. Landowners can shoot them year-round, at night, with suppressors, from vehicles. The regulatory infrastructure was designed to make killing as frictionless as possible, and hunters responded. By the mid-2010s, estimates suggested that recreational hunters and trappers were removing somewhere between 25 and 30% of Louisiana's feral hog population annually, a figure that sounds, on its surface, like meaningful progress. It was not meaningful progress. According to population modeling published by Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, sustained removal of 70% or more of a feral hog population annually is the minimum threshold required to achieve any net population reduction. Below that number, the reproductive rate 2 litters per year, averaging 5 to 6 piglets each, simply absorbs the losses and continues expanding. 25% removal, sustained across decades, did not slow the population. It selected it. This is the part that researchers do not publicize widely, because the implication is deeply uncomfortable. Dr. James Beasley, wildlife ecologist at the University of Georgia's Savannah River Ecology Laboratory, has documented in peer-reviewed research that targeted hunting pressure, particularly the kind applied by recreational hunters, who remove individual animals or small groups while leaving survivors, accelerates behavioral adaptation in feral hog populations. The animals that survive repeated hunting pressure are not random survivors. They are the most evasive, the most nocturnal, the most cautious. Hunters were not thinning the herd. They were, generation by generation, building a smarter one. Let that sink in. If this is reshaping what you thought you knew about the unstoppable hog invasion, hit subscribe. We dig into the data the mainstream glosses over, and what's coming next in this investigation is exactly why that matters. Because the real solution wasn't found in a hunting blind, it was found in the cockpit of a helicopter. The shift began in 2022, when USDA APHIS Wildlife Services quietly restructured its operational doctrine for feral hog removal across the Gulf South. The agency did not issue a press release. There was no congressional testimony, no environmental impact statement made public, no announcement in any outlet that covers wildlife management. What changed was a procurement line item. A 340% increase in contracted flight hours for turbine engine helicopters, equipped with forward-looking infrared systems and operated by specialized aerial gunners professionals who can place accurate fire on the mile-I-facted, moving targets from a moving aircraft at night, in terrain that a ground hunter cannot access on foot or by vehicle. The critical difference between aerial gunning and every ground-based removal method is not speed, it is completeness. A helicopter operating with thermal optics over a feral hog sounder, the family unit these animals travel and breed in, typically 8 to 30 animals, can identify every individual in that group simultaneously and remove the entire sounder in a single operation. No survivors. No educated animals retreating to warn the next generation. No behavioral adaptation passed down through the population because there is no population left to receive it. This is the principle that wildlife managers now call whole sounder removal, and it is the operational concept that finally broke the reproductive math that had defeated every previous strategy. But aerial gunning addressed only the terrain that helicopters could reach. For the dense bottomland forest and flooded marsh, where rotor wash and vegetation made aerial operations impossible, a second technological layer was deployed simultaneously, and this one is arguably more extraordinary. The borebuster system, developed with USDA research investment and now operating across hundreds of thousands of acres in Louisiana and Texas, uses cellular-connected camera networks and machine learning algorithms to monitor trap enclosures in real time. The system does not trigger when the first hog enters. It does not trigger when half the sounder is inside. It waits with a patience no human trapper can sustain until population analysis confirms the entire group is contained. Then it drops. The sounder is removed whole. The landscape receives no survivors capable of learned avoidance. 2 technologies, 1 doctrine, applied simultaneously across the same geography. When Dr. Michael Marlowe, wildlife biologist with 17 years of invasive species management in the Gulf South, was asked to characterize what this represented operationally, his answer was precise. We aren't hunting anymore. We are conducting biological surgery. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Is this conservation or is it something darker? We read every one, because this question is going to matter more as this investigation continues. Now, back to the evidence. Because the technology was only the beginning. They had a chemical secret. But here is where it gets truly impossible to ignore, because what the flight logs and the trap data don't show you is the third layer of this campaign. The one that left no shell casings, no rotor noise, no physical evidence of any kind, just silence, and animals that were there one week and gone the next. In 2023, following years of field trials in Australia, where sodium nitrite-based toxic baiting had already achieved documented population reductions of up to 80% in controlled zones, the EPA granted conditional, registered use of Hog, a sodium nitrite bait compound, for deployment in restricted feral hog eradication programs across the American South. The approval received almost no press coverage. There was no public comment period that drew meaningful public attention. It moved through the regulatory process with the quiet efficiency of an administrative formality. What sodium nitrite does, at the biological level, is both precise and devastating. The compound, when ingested at the concentrations present in the bait, converts hemoglobin to methemoglobin, a form incapable of carrying oxygen. The animal goes to sleep. It does not wake up. According to toxicology assessments filed with the EPA during the approval process, time to loss of consciousness averages between 1 and 4 hours, with mortality following shortly after. There is no secondary poisoning risk to scavengers at standard dosage levels. There is no contamination of the surrounding water table. It is, from a purely operational standpoint, a silent and geographically contained removal tool, and it works in the exact terrain that helicopters cannot reach and traps cannot cover. The 3-layer architecture of this campaign, aerial removal, AI-integrated trapping, and chemical baiting, was not applied sequentially. According to contractor deployment records, cross-referenced with parish-level treatment zone maps, all 3 methods were active simultaneously in the highest priority eradication sectors. The same geography, the same population, hit from above, from the ground, and from the food supply at the same time. That is not wildlife management. That is a coordinated extinction event for a targeted species, executed with industrial precision. If you made it this far, you're part of a rare group that prefers documented evidence over swamp mythology. Subscribe, because what this investigation is building toward is something the agencies running this program clearly do not want discussed publicly. And that raises the question this entire investigation has been building toward. If the hogs are gone or going, why has no agency announced it? Why is the crisis still being funded at emergency levels? Why would the government keep a victory this significant a secret? The answer, when you assemble every piece of this investigation, is not complicated. It is just uncomfortable. Here is what the evidence shows. A drone pilot files a zero-density report, and his supervisor assumes equipment failure. 11 grid sectors across 340,000 acres go silent within 14 months. A 340% increase in flight operations leaves no public announcement. An AI trap system achieves whole sounder removal with no survivors capable of behavioral transmission. A chemical compound moves through federal registration with the administrative footprint of a routine filing. 3 methods, 1 geography, 1 result. And not a single agency stands before the public and says, "We won." The question is no longer whether feral hog populations can be eradicated. The evidence has answered that. The question is, what it means that we develop the institutional capacity to erase a species from a landscape efficiently, quietly, and without public accountability, and chose to keep that capacity invisible. Because the machinery assembled to delete the feral hog from Louisiana's swamps did not disappear when the hogs did. The helicopters are still contracted, the AI systems are still deployed, the chemical approvals are still active, The infrastructure of total biological removal is still in place, fully funded, pointed at whatever comes next. Turn on notifications. Our next investigation goes inside the EPA's Missing Millions project, and what we found there makes everything in this video look like a field trial. The sensors returned a value of 0. And somewhere in a federal budget, a line item for the ongoing feral hog crisis is still being renewed.